All right, in this brief section, we're going to talk about shifts in the aggregate supply curves and what that means in our models. All right, so just as non-price level factors can cause shifts in the aggregate demand curve, they can also cause shifts in the aggregate supply curve or curves. Now, when the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts, it brings with it the short-run aggregate supply curve. So they shift together. If there's something that shifts long-run aggregate supply, it also shifts short-run aggregate supply. And this basically includes anything that brings about changes in endowments of the factors of production. So if we discover more resources like oil reserves, or we figure out a way to harvest asteroids for their metals, that would lead to both a long-run and short-run increase in aggregate supply. But there are some things that only shift the short-run aggregate supply curve, and these include things like changes in production, input prices, particularly those caused by temporary external events, such as this pandemic, right? So this pandemic has definitely decreased the short-run aggregate supply curve, but it is a temporary event. All right, so here's an example of something that increases long-run aggregate supply, and because it increases long-run aggregate supply, it also increases short-run aggregate supply. Okay, so this would be something like the development of a new technology that allows people to be more productive, and it's a permanent change. It could be, again, the discovery of oil or some other energy resource, something like that. Okay, so here's some examples of things that cause an increase in aggregate supply. So I already mentioned discoveries of raw materials. Increased competition can increase aggregate supply. Now keep in mind the opposite of these things would cause decreases in aggregate supply. Reductions in international trade barriers, right? So this causes costs of trading to go down, and so that allows us to be more productive. Fewer regulatory impediments for businesses, so the government reducing restrictions and regulations, which are a source of cost for the firm. An increase in the labor supply, right? So if more people get out there and want jobs or are looking for jobs, there's more people to be employed. That's a resource of production. And so that increase in the labor supply would increase aggregate supply. Increased training and education, right? That makes people more productive. A decrease in marginal tax rates. So the reason that works is because if you decrease what you charge people in taxes, they're more motivated to work because the government isn't taking as much of their money. And then, of course, the reduction of input prices. So if inputs are cheaper, then it's cheaper to make things. All right, so that was the third section on shifts in aggregate supply. Pretty brief. In the next section, we're going to look at the consequences of changes in aggregate demand.